9, where the heading is The Man Born Blind. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus replied. "But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "go. Wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they wanted to know. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He then told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," he replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner," for they saw Jesus as a sinner, "how can a sinner do miraculous signs?" So they were divided. Finally they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." I'm going to skip a few verses for the sake of the battery of the camera. I'm going to jump to verse 4. I don't want to confuse you. Okay, let's jump to verse 30. The blind man answered the Pharisees, "Now that is remarkable. You say you don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. I don't know who he is, but this I do know. I was blind, but now I see." The passage continues to verse 41, and you can in your private time check it out, where the Pharisees continue throwing their toys, where they continue complaining and continue being unhappy about what Jesus had done. They were trying so hard to put him to the test. There's also a further conversation between Jesus and the blind man. Jesus explaining the spiritual blindness of the Pharisees. Imagine, just for a few seconds, what it must feel like having been born blind. It's hard to imagine because we've had sight all our lives. And although when I look at the average age in this place, I can guess that some of your vision is not what it used to be, it must be a very awkward and very awful thing, having been born blind. Not having any idea what colors look like, what different shades are all about. Having no idea what people talk about when they define and describe. The Gospel of John, as we've just seen, excuse the pun, the Gospel of John, as we have just seen, has a record of a man having been born blind. And this is, of course, a supernatural act of Jesus to heal him and to cause him to see. John, however, lists the miracles one by one as the chapters go by. This is not the first miracle we encounter in John's Gospel. There is, of course, the very impressive wedding at Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine. One of our favorite miracles, of course. Later on, there is the healing at the pool of Bethesda, where a man sat there for 38 years waiting to be healed. It was the belief in those days that when the waters moved, that the first one jumping in would be healed of his or her ailment. That man, being paralyzed, of course, never got that opportunity. So he sat there at the side of the pool for 38 years. How do we know that that's a long time? We know that it's a long time because I've just turned 38. So that's my whole lifetime of every breath I've ever taken. There's another very fancy miracle that Jesus pulls off with the feeding of the 5,000. That's also one of our favorites, because that which has to do with food and snacks, how can that not be one of our favorites? There's something very profound about this miracle, however. This miracle in John chapter 9, where Jesus doesn't look left or right, where he heals this man without any questions asked and without any stings attached. I don't know if you noticed the question that the disciples pulled early on, wanting to know from Jesus where sin was involved. They were so convinced that sin is what had caused this man's blindness, either his or his parents or both. And they wanted to have some kind of discussion, some kind of debate on this kind of theology. It looks like Jesus quickly pointed them to the right direction, saying that no one had sinned, but that this had become a chance in front of their very eyes for God's glory to be shown and to be revealed. Jesus, of course, nipped this whole idea of sin causing blindness or any kind of illness for that matter in the bud. All that the disciples ended up beholding was God's grace in overdrive. I would like for us to look at the characters in the passage individually. As we make a study of John chapter 9, I suppose I can't unpack everybody who was involved. For instance, we're not going to talk about the neighbors of the blind man. We're not even going to talk about the disciples. I want to zoom in on what I think the main characters in the passage are. Firstly, we have to talk about Jesus himself and how he handled this so beautifully. Jesus was walking along, as it says there in verse 1, seemingly minding his own business, when he came across this man born blind. I think it's rather interesting that John uses the word saw, that Jesus saw the man, actually introducing the whole theme for the entire chapter. It becomes clear to the reader from very early on that all that Jesus wanted for this man was for him to be able to see. For this man to be able to live happily and healthily. For this man to fit in normally into society. For his rejection. For his humiliation to end, for that feeling of not being the same as others to end, for him to perhaps find a job, to care for his family, for him to be accepted in the community. And above all, if there was any unresolved guilt, for that to be addressed. For I have a funny feeling that this man himself had asked that very question. Is it because of my sin that I now have to face blindness for the rest of my days? Or is it because of something that my parents had done? Jesus addresses this, and Jesus says, no. We need to look at this from a different perspective altogether. God's glory is about to be seen in the most exciting way. Only later does Jesus explain the theology of the blindness, etc., etc. That's the part of the passage we did not read. But Jesus was not under any circumstances going to allow for the disciples' theory of sin and blindness to have its way. Later on in the passage we see that this miracle happened on the Sabbath. It was not Jesus' first miracle on a Sabbath. The healing at the pool, the 38-year person, wasn't 38 years old, he had sat there for 38 years. That very person had also been healed by Jesus on a Sabbath. So Jesus had two ticks next to his name. Somehow the Pharisees were keeping a mental list of all Jesus' mishaps and wrongdoings. So there were already two strikes. They were just waiting for the third. Jesus was starting to make a habit of healing people on a Sabbath, which was a great taboo. Although it didn't faze him, the Pharisees had a huge problem with it. They would worry about when a healing happened, how it happened, where it happened, and to whom it happened. Whereas Jesus' only concern was to make people whole. Before we talk about the Pharisees, I want to zoom in on the blind man for a while. He started off as the man born blind, and he ended up as the man who could now see. Can you imagine his excitement when his eyes opened for the first time? Just think about that for a second. Can you imagine his joy when he spotted trees and birds for the first time? When he noticed the vast sky above him? Can you imagine how he tried to protect his eyes when he noticed the brightness of the sun? He must have been overwhelmed by colors themselves. I wonder how he tried to make sense of red. How does one talk about red? Maybe he just said, gosh, I never knew that red was so red.
Happy.
And yellow must have been his favorite color because it's so bright and so alive and so dynamic. Never mind the colors. Just imagine what he felt when he saw his parents' faces for the first time. He had no idea what they looked like, and they are included as participants in this passage. So they were still alive by the time this miracle happened. He must have looked into his mom's face, and he must have burst into tears. This man born blind, however, whose name we don't know, he did not only see stuff that made him happy on this fateful day. He also saw the Pharisees coming toward him. Isn't it? And he knew from the very start that these were a crazy bunch. A sketchy kind of people. had been asking questions about this case right from its start. Did they dance with this man who had his sight recovered? No. They were judging from the very word go, wanting to find fault with Jesus, wanting to blame him for having not observed the Sabbath accordingly. Before we put our magnifying glass onto the Pharisees, let us take notice of what this man said to the Pharisees. The detail of how he was healed did not matter to this guy. He was just happy, so happy that he just made his famous statement in verse 25. I don't know anything about Jesus, for the Pharisees were investigating him, interrogating him, wanting to find out details about Jesus. And he was just honest. He said, I know nothing about Jesus. I hadn't even met him before. I don't know where he comes from. I don't know what he's up to. But this I do know for absolute sure. I was blind, and now I'm no longer blind. Seeing to this man was more important than understanding. Dare I say, seeing was believing. Now we come to those who cast such a shadow on this miracle. These dodgy creatures known as the Pharisees. They were a piece of work. Man, they were a piece of work. You know what thoughts come to mind whenever I say the word Pharisees? Words like slimy and conniving come to mind. Words like false and plastic and unreal. These are words that come to mind when I see how this group behaved. When I hear the word Pharisee, I cannot help but shudder. They missed nothing. They were stalking Jesus to try and catch him out. And of course, when I say Pharisees, you need to know in your mind what they were about. For they were strict, rigid, orthodox Jews who would not allow for there to be any deviation from the law of Moses in the Old Testament. They followed every single rule and regulation to the nth degree. It became quite sickening, and the average person could not live up to their standards. Needless for me to say is that they became so pretentious, and so self-righteous, and so arrogant, and so proud. They were orthodox in the extreme, and they thought of themselves too highly. They felt superior to the Sadducees and the Essenes, who were the other religious groups of New Testament times. In fact, I would not be surprised if they claimed to be the closest to God. Of all the groups in existence, they believed that they were the closest to the Most High God. That they were the only ones who were pleasing him. That they were the only ones making him proud. Jesus challenges them in several parts of the gospel, and it's like Jesus' face tells the story. I could just see Jesus' disappointed look as he witnessed what they were about. And if the look could speak, it would probably say something to the effect of, "That don't impress me much." Jesus challenged them in the Sermon on the Mount, remember? By saying stuff like, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the peacemakers in God's sight, for they will be called the sons and the daughters of God." Also in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses this whole issue of people wanting to have all sorts of highfalutin prayers, coming up with big words and drawn out phrases, trying to win God's favor. There's another place where Jesus doesn't beat around the bush, where Jesus actually calls them out for exactly what they were. A brood of vipers, he says they are. Quote, whitewashed tombs, unquote. Jesus had no time for the Pharisees, for Jesus saw, you see, this whole thing of seeing is quite a big thing. Jesus saw with his very own eyes their spiritual rot. And Jesus was not going to tolerate that. You see, the Old Testament law stated that only if a life was threatened could healing be done on a Sabbath. I'm not sure if this makes sense to you. Only if a life of a particular person was threatened could that person be healed on a Sabbath. So if one had a little bit of pain or a little bit of discomfort, one had to wait until the Sunday in order for a physician to heal you. You would have to sit with your suffering and wait until the Saturday was over. So from Friday at about sunset to Saturday about sunset, no healings were allowed unless the situation was utterly severe. And Jesus, at one particular point in time, just shook his head and said that that is the world system. That is the system that the Pharisees dreamt out for themselves. That wasn't God's system. If Jesus could relieve somebody's pain right on the spot, that is exactly what he ended up doing. Whether it was a man at the pool sitting there for 38 years, or a person having been born blind. Once again, I can just see an expression on Jesus' face. I can just see if his expression could actually have words. It would be, "You've got to be kidding me." The Sabbath laws were absolutely non-negotiable and non-compromisable to the Pharisees. Here's the thing. They were totally and completely spiritually blind. They claimed that they understood the law, that they interpreted every single regulation and rule in the Pentateuch, meaning the first 5 books of the Bible. They were the experts, per se, but they had no idea of the meaning of the kingdom of God. Towards the end of the passage, which is your homework, remember, you need to go and study that for yourself, since I didn't read to the end of the chapter. There is this conversation between the man that had been healed and Jesus. The Pharisees later on threw this man out of the synagogue. He was no longer allowed at gatherings, simply because he had been healed by Jesus, who they claimed was a sinner. Jesus then explains to this man that he had experienced God's kingdom firsthand, that he had had a taste of God's grace and God's undeserved favor, and that the Pharisees were the ones losing out on that glorious knowledge of how God can change lives. You see, I really don't think that one can steal God's heart by following a set of rules from back in the day, dotting every I and stroking every T. I don't think God is interested in a mind service. I think God wants the sacrifice of the heart. So what do we learn from today as I bring this to a close? We learn from Jesus that love overrides the law, that compassion comes first, that mercy has to always win. Second, we learn from the blind man who was no longer blind that one has to be happy, has to be grateful when God does something wondrous for you. For you will see in the passage that he could not speak. He could not stop speaking about it. Not even to the Pharisees who he was busy agitating. He had a story to tell, and he was going to tell it at any cost. And thirdly, we learn from the Pharisees that God calls us from legalism, from a life of judgment and pettiness and casting blame, to the freedom which accompanies love. We cannot worship rules and regulations. We need to worship the God who liberated us from our sins. The Pharisees teach us an important lesson when it comes to this spiritual blindness thing. For they had not come to an understanding of who God is and how God rules. Sometimes it is indeed those who have perfect vision who are truly blind. Amen. We're going to have a little bit of silence as we reflect and then have our closing song.